And I just want to thank first our panelists, who I will introduce here in a minute, and also thank everyone who's attending, is listening in today, tonight. Really appreciate the interest. This is our first time doing a webinar series on Zoom in this kind of new reality, and so far they've been really successful and lots of people joining, and it's been positive for us and hopefully positive for others. And my name is Sam Mace. I'm the Inland Northwest Director for Save Our Wild Salmon Coalition. I live in Eastern Washington and Spokane, and have been involved in the effort on Snake River dams a little more than 20 years now for different entities. Have seen a lot of things happen, for the positive, for the not positive, but I will say that where we are right now with the momentum and people coming together, I am the most hopeful I've been in a long time that we can restore this river, the Lower Snake River. Anyway, but enough about me. I want to introduce our panelists, and our topic tonight is looking at what restoring the Lower Snake River and restoring salmon would mean for the indigenous peoples and tribes here in the Northwest. And I'm really excited to introduce our two speakers tonight. The first one is Elliott Moffett, who's a member of the Nez Perce Tribe, and he lives in Idaho. And he is one of the founders of a wonderful organization called Nimiipuu Protecting the Environment, which has, for the last couple of decades at least, advocated for environmental stewardship, protection, river restoration, removal of the 4 Lower Snake River dams, and honoring the 1855 treaty with the Nez Perce Tribe. And it's been great. Save Our Wild Salmon has partnered with Nimiipuu Protecting the Environment over a number of years, organizing and putting on the Free the Snake Flotilla and River Day on the Snake River that, we've had at the largest one, 800 people turning out, and the tribe or Nimiipuu Protecting the Environment was really critical to making that event a success. And so really want to welcome Elliott and thank you, Elliott, for taking the time tonight to take part in this and share your perspective. And our second speaker is Scott Hauser. He's executive director of the Upper Snake River Tribes. And I'm real excited for us to be having a speaker talking about what's happening farther up the Snake River in this presentation, because there's a lot of really critical issues and things at stake up there. And Scott has a background, he has degrees in history and political science, a master's in environmental science. He's worked with the U.S. Forest Service, and currently in his role for the Upper Snake River Tribes, he is working on this issue as part of the Idaho Governor's Working Group on Salmon. I'll leave that to him to share a little bit more about that. And he's also participating in the NOAA Fisheries Columbia Basin Partnership Task Force, which is a group of various stakeholders, scientists, and interests that have been having some conversations on how to restore Columbia Basin salmon. And I think with that, our first panelist speaker is going to be Elliott, and then Scott's going to follow from there. And I think right now I'll just hand it over to you, Elliott.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam, for that introduction. And thank you for hosting this event as well. As you know, as you said, Nimiipuu Protecting the Environment has been working with Save Our Wild Salmon for a few years, and they're one of our wonderful partners. And we hope to continue in that relationship. It's good to be on the panel this evening with Scott. It's good to know him and to know that there's protection going on with the Upper Snake River and the Upper Snake River people. It'll be interesting to hear what he has to say. I'd like to first kind of add a little bit to the introduction, let folks know that a little bit about the tribe and a little bit about Nimiipuu Protecting the Environment, and then kind of finish up on what kind of activities we've been participating in. The Nez Perce Tribe, I'm a member, as Sam had alluded to earlier, to the Nez Perce Tribe. I'm a member, and we just met, actually, the tribal government, and we have a written constitution, and we meet twice a year in a general council where all the voting membership comes and deals with issues of tribal affairs and Indian affairs. So, but we date ourselves. There was a recent study, or archaeological study, concluded on the Salmon River, where it was learned that our relatives have been here for at least 16,000 years in this part of the country. And that is fairly significant, because what that means is that that we may have been around for kind of late Ice Age activity, and even down in southern Idaho country, where the Bonneville, the ice dam floods, or the floods, the Bonneville flood came down, and Missoula flood. There may have been people around to actually experience those. So that's kind of mind blowing to know that that our people may have seen rivers forming, and the coulees develop, and things like that in this Pacific Northwest. But the Nez Perce have been in this part of the country for that long. Central Idaho, parts of Montana, Washington, and Oregon. And our culture has been involved with salmon during that whole time. And salmon was central to our culture, to the Nimiipuu culture. And when there was contact, European contact, then we were called Nez Perce, and that's French for pierce nose, but we didn't have a practice of piercing our nose, but that was kind of one of the stories that was told of how we came to that name. But we call ourselves Nimiipuu, and that just means the people. And our story, I live probably a mile away from the heart of the monster. And you know, one of the things that archaeological study demonstrated was that we didn't come across on the Bering Sea Bridge and our story is that we came from the heart of the monster, which is just down about a mile from where I currently live in Kamiah, Idaho. And that was a story of how coyote came and helped develop the population, not only Nez Perce, but surrounding tribes as well. So that is our creation. And from that, then we have come to believe in the sanctity and sacredness of Mother Earth. And we try to find and give sustenance to that belief and those values. So the sacredness of all things is what we try to bring to the table as far as discussions of issues of environmental protections. And when we do that, then sometimes it is relevant to the discussions. Other times we have to rely on other arguments to support our position that all things are sacred, and we're here to protect Mother Earth. And so that often leads to understanding the laws, for an example, rules and regulations about how environments are managed. And we have to be as cognizant about those issues as we do in our own cultural understandings. So sometimes we communicate that we have a particular interest in a area or even a sacred area, and we have to communicate that to entities or agencies sometimes that want to do projects there. and we have to deal with other entities in order to have protections in place if we need to be. And sometimes we just may object to a project that's going on because of the dangers to the environment. Usually when I talk, I also have to start off with a disclaimer that even though I'm a member of the tribe and I have employment with the tribe, I don't represent the tribe, the Nez Perce tribal government. I'm not authorized to do that. So that's one of the things that I have to lead off with. But we got started on Nimiipuu Protecting the Environment around the times that the megalodes came through the Nez Perce reservation. And megalodes are big, gigantic pieces of equipment. And these particular ones were headed to the tar sands in Canada, and they were being transported through the reservation. They had been transported through other parts of Idaho as well, and different communities had responded to that also. But in our case, they came through the reservation, and the tribal council, as well as individual tribal members, objected to that and had a rolling blockade of those pieces of equipment. And so there was a legal action that was taken because we thought that the United States Forest Service had a regulatory place there that they didn't think they did, but the court told them that they did. So that's how we got our start, was during the megalodes demonstrations. And we believe Julian Matthews, who is a co-founder of Nimiipuu Protecting the Environment, and I believe that we have to help our tribal membership get more politically active because of the ramifications of these different activities going on, that they should understand that these projects are ongoing and that we should have a right to say what happens on our reservation and within the treaty area. And so we try, and we understand about the Nez Perce Treaty. The first one was in 1855. And in exchange for, they call it cessions of land, that in return for those cedings of the land, that there was a promise by the United States to, among other things, to bring back fish, to help the fish come back so that we could continue in our ways of life. And now that isn't happening. Just recently, the Rapid River fisheries closed on the Salmon River, and so it's closing now for treaty fishing. And usually this goes on through July, but because of the decimated fish runs, we're not able to exercise our treaty rights to our usual and accustomed areas of fishing. And so that is a concern of ours, and it has been a concern, and that is why we've advocated for the breaching of the 4 lower Snake River dams. And so that kind of leads us up to where we are right now. And I just might point out that the tribe has, first tribe, the government has adopted a resolution in opposition to the 4 lower Snake dams. And we advocated and got passed in 2018 a resolution from the General Council that also opposes the 4 lower Snake dams. And at our recent meeting, which had to be rescheduled because of COVID-19, then I got a resolution passed that actually recognizes the rights of the Snake River to exist. And so this is just a new development that we don't even have a signed copy of the resolution yet. So when that comes off the presses, then we'll be able to get that out. But so that kind of brings us up to speed on where we are with Nimiipuu Protecting the Environment. And I think pretty much taken up my time. How are we doing,
Good.
Sam?
Oh, we're doing okay. Do you have a few other comments to say, or do you want to wait till the Q&A?
Oh, I can wait. I was just leaving it
Okay.
up to trying to get, hopefully we can get some comments or some questions, and just wanted
Sure.
to provide some material for questions.
Sure. And one quick thing, I was so excited just to get to our panelists. I will just want to say 2 sentences about Save Our Wild Salmon Coalition, if there's any folks new or not aware of who we are, but we are a coalition of conservation organizations, sport fishing groups and businesses, commercial fishing associations, organizations working on clean energy issues, like real clean energy issues. And that kind of came together in 1991 when the runs were all getting listed on the Endangered Species Act. And in 1997, we endorsed removal of the lower Snake River dams. It's not the only thing we needed to do for the fisheries, but it had to be the cornerstone of an effective recovery plan, and that both the biology and the economics really supported it. And so that's kind of who we are. And so we obviously don't have tribes as our members because they're sovereign nations, but we do work closely with tribes in the basin, and Nimiipuu Protecting the Environment is a member of our coalition. But anyway, now I'm going to hand it over to Scott to talk about upriver.
Thank you, Sam. I appreciate it. I have a PowerPoint, so when you're ready to share screens, have it up, and we'll move through. And thank you, Elliott. I really appreciate the words that you said.
You bet,
it's going to be hard to go after you. It's going to be hard to go after you. So thanks, Sam, again, and thanks, Elliott. Sorry to make you guys wait a few minutes. Again, my name is Scott Hauser. I'm the executive director of the Upper Snake River Tribes Foundation. We're located in Boise, Idaho. And USERT works for 4 Indian tribes. And I should say that, as Elliott said earlier, I'm not here representing any of the individual member tribes of USERT. Here representing just USERT. Also, I am not a tribal member, so I will only be touching on cultural, spiritual aspects of salmon and steelhead at a very, very high level, out of respect for the tribes that I work for. So as you can see, I work for the Burns Paiute, the Fort McDermott Paiute and Shoshone Bannock at Fort Hall, and the Shoshone Paiute in Duck Valley. So our tribes cross 3 states, Idaho, Oregon, and Nevada. USERT was formed in 1998, and then in 2007, we obtained nonprofit status as a 501c3. I came on as USERT's second employee in 2012. We're funded through Bonneville Power Administration, their coordination dollars, Environmental Protection Agency. We receive Bureau of Indian Affairs funding, and we receive a little bit of independent funding through donations. Some of our main services include issue tracking and regional coordination. We draft numerous technical documents, particularly comment letters. We also policy statements, and then we do the best that we can to build greater capacity for the 4 tribes of USERT. There's 2 levels of coordination with the tribes through USERT. We have our technical work group that we meet with monthly, and that's technical staff from each of USERT's 4 tribes. Excuse me. And then we also have our commission. Many of you would think of it as a board of directors, and that's comprised of 2 elected officials from each of USERT's 4 tribes. We meet every month and just prior to this presentation, we had met today. So when I got on the call to prep with Sam, I was a little scattered, having just had a daily meeting with the tribes talking about a lot of important issues. So some of the regional salmon issues, salmon steelhead issues that we're involved in currently is the NOAA Fisheries, Marine Fisheries Advisory Committee, Columbia Basin Partnership. That's a two-phased approach. We're in phase 2 now. Phase 1, work to develop quantitative and qualitative goals for salmon and steelhead for the next coming decades. Now we're in closing out phase 2, and phase 2 is how do we achieve those quantitative and qualitative goals. Also a member of the Idaho Governor's Salmon Working Group. We've been very involved throughout the years in the Power Council Fish and Wildlife Program amendments process. Currently, they're updating their 2014 program with an addendum. And so we've been very involved in providing comments and attending meetings. USERT was a cooperating agency in the CRSO, EIS, continues to be a cooperating agency. We are also heavily involved in the Columbia River Treaty, along with the 15 Columbia Basin tribes and the 2 other consortia, the Columbia Basin, CRIDFIC, and UCUT. We've completed 4 climate change projects, and a big focus of those projects is salmon and water. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail. Hells Canyon Complex relicensing, a series of 3 dams owned by Idaho Power, is something that we work extensively on. So the Upper Snake River tribes, only one of the 4 tribes has a treaty, and that's the Shoshone Bannock tribe located in Fort Hall. And as you see on the screen, Article 4 of their treaty says that the tribe has the right to hunt on the unoccupied lands of the United States so long as game is found thereon. You notice the word fish is not in there. At the time of the treaty, the tribe did not have a word for fish. And starting in the early 70s with Idaho versus Pinot case, the tribe challenged that hunt also means fish. And after several decades of legal battles, it was affirmed through the federal courts that hunt does also mean fish for the Shoshone Bannock tribe. The other 3 tribes, Burns Paiute, Far McDermott, and Shoshone Paiute, are executive order tribes, although they entered into, as you can see, the Bruno, the Fort Bridger, the Long Tom Creek, the Malheur, and the Soda Spring treaties. And I apologize, there's an error. It should be the Fort Boise Treaty of 1864, not Fort Bridger. And for some context on the Fort Boise Treaty of 1864, so here's a map of Idaho, and you can see Boise. So if that treaty would have been ratified, it would have given the tribes of the Upper Snake all the land north and south 30 miles of the Boise River, which, as you can see, is a huge portion of southern Idaho, and where I hazard a guess 80% of Idaho's population lives. And unfortunately, that treaty was not ratified. A quick tribal perspective on salmon recovery. It's informed, again, by their culture and spirituality, their contemporary needs, and the tribes have large fish and wildlife staff and scientists on board. So they are very involved in the best available science and also add to that science. The tribes have a holistic view of the needs of salmon and themselves, which include restoring the ecological function of the Snake River, improving access to subsistence foods by increasing abundance, maintaining that cultural and spiritual connection between tribal members and salmon, and also protecting protect populations of anadromous fish and their habitat in a changing climate. Looking at historic salmon harvest in the basin, going back to when records first started, around 1870, you can see that for about 65, 70 years, harvest, as records were kept, were as high as 50 million pounds. And then as the Columbia River system dam started coming online, that harvest of salmon precipitously declines to very, very low numbers in the single million digits of pounds. So historically, the tribes of Usert were primarily, their primary food source was salmon. And there's been numerous research, including Hughes and Walker and Schultz, that estimated that the Bannock, Paiute, and Shoshone people historically consumed as much as 700 pounds of salmon per tribal member per year. So nearly 2 pounds of fish per day per tribal member. Tragically, the last 10 years, the average is that approximately 200 salmon are harvested in the Upper Snake River Basin, meaning that each tribal member is eating 0.6 pounds of salmon per year, where historically they may have eaten as much as 2 pounds per day. And so for some contemporary context, the Environmental Protection Agency has a subsistence standard for high fish consuming populations, largely tribes, but there's also some minority communities in the United States that are also large fish consumers. So EPA has set a standard of 142.4 grams per day for subsistence communities, which is roughly 5 ounces per day. So if you were to take the EPA standard of 142.4 grams per day, times that by 1 year, there's approximately 12,000 tribal members composed of the 4 Usert tribes. There's a need to harvest, or there's a need for 1,375,050 pounds of salmon per year. And let's take a conservative assumption that each salmon has 8 pounds of meat. That would require, at minimum, 171,881 salmon returning to the Upper Snake per year. And as you recall from the previous slide, the last 10 years, the average annual harvest has been 200 fish. So I'm going to talk very quickly about the Hells Canyon complex. As you can see on the map, it straddles Oregon and Idaho on the Snake River. So historically, there were 9 major river basins in the Upper Snake that supported anadromy. 1890, that anadromy began to be blocked with the construction of the Bruno Dam. Hells Canyon was constructed between 58 and 67. That entirely blocks the Upper Snake River Basin from anadromy. There is no fish passage at the Hells Canyon complex. The license expired in 2005, but because of the way that FERC works, Idaho Power keeps receiving annual licenses every year. A big stumbling block has been receiving a 401 certification from Idaho and Oregon, largely because they cannot meet salmon spawning temperature criteria in the fall. However, the states of Idaho, Oregon, and Idaho Power, excluding tribes and any other party, entered into a settlement agreement to resolve 401 issues about a year ago. And one term of that settlement agreement states that for the next 20 years, there can not be any reintroduction of spring summer Chinook or steelhead above the project without agreement among Idaho, Oregon, and Idaho Power. And in fact, one thing I didn't add on the slide is that those three entities cannot discuss this issue with any non-party to the agreement for the next 20 years. And it's also important to note that while this has been submitted to FERC, FERC has not approved this settlement agreement as of yet. Another recent development in Idaho inhibiting reintroduction efforts in the Upper Snake is Idaho signed by Governor Brad Little a couple months ago, instituted in blocked area policy, which states that there can be no reintroduction of ESA listed fish above Hells Canyon. Any reintroduction has to be non-ESA listed fish, and it also has to be consistent with Idaho statutes. And Idaho has passed several statutes which further prohibits reintroduction of salmon and steelhead into the Upper Snake without approval of the governor and legislature. The policy also speaks to the settlement agreement, which I also just talked about. Any reintroduction efforts cannot take away from existing funding that Idaho receives for salmon and steelhead efforts. And as long as those commitments are met, we can look at a put and take, or as the tribes call it, a ceremonial fishery in historical habitat. So prior to both the blocked area policy and the settlement agreement, USERT with its member tribes and the federal partners, NOAA Fisheries and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we developed a reintroduction plan for above the Hells Canyon complex. We've submitted that to FERC. It's a three-pronged approach, which looks at establishing a ceremonial fishery in the Upper Snake. Then we moved to a population of a sustainable harvestable population of salmon and steelhead in tributaries of the Upper Snake. And then the long-term goal is to restore fall Chinook to the main stem Snake River. Finally, I'm going to conclude with a couple slides and then a very short video. So as I mentioned, the Upper Snake is blocked to anadromy, and given that 3 of USERT's 4 tribes do not have a treaty right, an off-reservation right, they have no access to salmon or steelhead. So beginning in 2015, the tribes, partnering with Idaho Fish and Game, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, started a ceremonial fishery in the East Fork of Waihe and in the Upper Malheur River. As you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, this was the feature story in the Idaho Statesman. It was the first time that tribal members were able to catch salmon in the Waihe River in 87 years. It was a very, an incredibly touching, important moment for the tribes in the first of very long steps of returning that cultural and spiritual connection between tribal members and salmon. I'm now going to turn to a 3-minute video that highlights the Burns Paiute first ceremonial fishery, which was the first time that their tribe had been able to harvest salmon in the Malheur River in 98 years. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sam and see if there's questions for Elliott and myself.
All right, well, thank you both. And yeah, we have some great questions in the queue here. The first one is directed towards Elliott, and the question is, are you working with CELTF in establishing Snake River rights, which I believe is like the Center for Environmental Law, or I'm going to get it wrong.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that one, but We have, as you mentioned, with Save Our Wild Salmon, then Nimiipuu Protecting the Environment is also a nonprofit, and so we try to coordinate with other groups that are like-minded, and so we work on issues of even down on the Columbia River with the Columbia River Keepers, for an example, on protecting the Columbia River, because the salmon obviously have to run through there, and so the more we can get other organizations to join us and we join them, I feel the stronger our voice will be. And so we are interested in working with as many groups as we can to get the word out about how we need to act expeditiously for the fish and for the river. But I don't know that organization in particular.
Maybe we can put a link to CELDF in our chat room.
Great.
Next question is a great one, and this would be for both of you, is what are the most helpful things that non-tribal activists and environmental organizations can do to support tribal members, tribal organizations, and tribal governments to make progress on salmon restoration and dam removal?
I can start off with that, and one of them is doing exactly this, is to listen to advocates and subject matter experts, if you will, on the issue. Education is one of our purposes as well, and we try to conduct environmental summits to get the information out, because we also believe in citizen activities, but we believe that they should be informed about these issues, because they are policy matters and everyone's voice. And so we'd like to encourage that to happen. And then to become more educated and go to Save Our Wild Salmon site. They have a lot of educational information on that site about everything you'd ever want to know about dam breaching or management of the Columbia River system. And the final thing that on that question is that advocating as an ally of Indigenous people, I would make sure that representatives know that the treaty still exists, that it's vital, and that the Indigenous people want to just to make sure that we live up to the promises that were made back in the early relationship with the United States. Scott.
Thank you, Elliott. And yeah, I don't have much more to add. I think just advocate and talk to your elected officials for them to make decisions that increase salmon and steelhead abundance in the basin. And that alone will help support the tribal needs. I would also say something similar to what, as a non-tribal, I'm speaking as a non-tribal member, is educate yourself about the tribes, get to know them better, and be very cautious of not thinking you know what is best for the tribe. Get to know them. That is often all very well-intentioned people, but the tribes and NGOs have had some, rocky relationships at times, because NGOs believe that they know what's best for the tribes without really talking with them. So, treat everybody as equals and humans, and support salmon and steelhead, and that's going to go a long way.
Great. Next question is, in the work for restoring salmon in the areas that you both work on, do the tribes in those areas consider southern resident killer whales in their work and the needs of those whales?
Thank you, Sam, for that question too. And as you know, we've had orca representatives at our flotilla for the past few years, and they've been integral to the success of our flotilla because we recognize that everything is connected, and the river is connected to the ocean. And in that ocean, there are species that rely, just like us, on the salmon. And we look from this all the way from the ocean up through Alaska, where the fish migrate, all the way back up to the headwaters of the Clearwater and Lochsaw rivers. And up in that region, there are grizzly bears, and they too are apex predators, and they need the salmon too. So we're looking not only on the ocean side, but also in the wilderness area to reintroduce grizzly bears as well.
I'll just add on very quickly. So in the Columbia River Treaty discussions we've been looking at creating a mutual benefits document with the Indigenous nations of Canada. And so one of the mutual benefits that we see is we try to advocate for ecosystem-based function, which will increase salmon steelhead abundance, is the benefits to orca. So certainly, you know, we're way up in the basin, but orca is the tribes look at everything holistically. So yes, we do talk about the orca.
There's a few questions that kind of overlap a little bit, but one gets to treaties. Maybe this is an opportunity to talk a little more or expand, if you feel like it, on treaty rights and what those mean. The one question was, you know, there are existing treaties that, you know, provide for the fishing rights to the tribes as part of a treaty or a contract. And why are those not honored, and how can we ensure and help make sure those treaties are honored?
And I can refer back to what Scott was talking about, that there are people with their roles and responsibilities that, for an example, like the federal agencies have what's called a trust responsibility. That means they're to act almost as a fiduciary in the interest of the tribes and the tribal members. And so we're continually trying to hold the federal government's feet to the fire and recognizing that they have that trust responsibility. And it's been termed as a moral obligation of the United States to comply with those promised treaties. So the federal agencies have a trust responsibility because they're dealing with trust resources like an Indigenous fish. And on this side, then Forest Service also has a trust responsibility to act in the best interest of the subject of those treaties, which most often that we're talking about is salmon. So we're continuing to educate folks about the treaty as well. And if there needs to be more information, then we can put out the information. Just supplying the treaties themselves may be of some use. So we might want to look into that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, because of what's happening right now, it's not happening this year, but the Shoshone Bannock have a treaty rights seminar every year, and that's open to anyone. That happens at Fort Hall. And so, you know, hopefully that will happen again next year. But, you know, sadly, the feds and states, you know, going back to that blocked area policy, which was just signed by the governor, that is a clear violation of treaty rights. And, you know, the difficult decision that tribes have to make is if they want to litigate over something like that, they have a lot to win, but they also have a lot to lose because you don't know what the court's going to say. And if you were to throw your, you know, put your treaty rights out there to have them litigated and you were on the losing end, you're going to see that treaty diminish. So, you know, we're in an unfortunate situation where, you know, entities that need to understand that treaties are the supreme law of the land, and they just don't recognize that.
I'm going to slightly combine the next two questions. One is like is a question from someone who lives in Washington State. So asking the question of, how important it is for the Nimiipuu and neighboring tribes to have the lower Snake River restored in terms of sustenance, spirituality, and culture. And of course, to restore the lower Snake River and help get salmon and fisheries back up to the upper Snake, removing the 4 lower Snake River dams is a cornerstone to that. And so the second question was, how can we help the Nez Perce tribes work in that? So mostly Elliott, but Scott, if you want to chime in too.
Yeah, that's a good question too. Yeah, we want those dams removed, and we think that's the best way that we can get fish back, not only for our treaty rights. And one of the things I left off about that treaty rights is when we talk about those rights, then we talk about responsibilities as well. We just don't talk about the rights, we talk about our responsibilities. And so we're trying to meet that responsibility by acting in the best interest for these fish and for the river. And this is a time of year. This is springtime, and the rivers are high with a lot of silt, and they're taking all that sediment load downstream, and they're being deposited in the reservoirs. They no longer reach beyond the reservoirs to create habitat downstream, but in fact are sitting and filling up the riverbeds on the Snake River. And so they're slowing down the river. They're causing pollution, the thermal pollution. I understand that some of the dams may even leak petroleum into the rivers. So that's a very big concern. And the tribe has contributed for the spilling of water to help the smolts reach the ocean. And that is under our treaty rights. That's a responsibility. But so the tribes are taking a large bunch of responsibility. Essentially, like in the water rights area, we're giving up water rights in order to help the smolts reach the oceans. So that's a kind of, and just as Scott was mentioning, when we do engage in litigation, that type of work, then we have to divert resources that could be used in other things. And so that is an environmental injustice, actually. So getting involved in activities, activities that bring what I would call more common sense to the management of the rivers is what we would advocate for. Becoming a member of these different organizations, nonprofits, was also helpful. And there are many that you could choose from that would advocate for more sensible environmental protections.
Great. Anything to add, Scott?
No, all I'll say is the importance of reaching the dam. So Elliott mentioned the treaty rights, and so the Shoshone Bannock, they have a treaty right. And as I showed earlier, historically, they would have eaten as much as 2 pounds of fish per day. In the last 10 years, they're averaging 200 fish a year for that tribe. So there's an incredible need to breach those dams for that. And then to the ceremonial fishery, every year we're reliant on, the tribes are reliant that there's surplus fish for them to be transported down to the reservations out in the blocked area. And there's no certainty every year. The Shoshone Paiute will not be getting fish this year for a ceremonial fishery. And so removing those 4 impediments will hopefully bring more certainty for that fishery. and start restoring that cultural connection. And I also I would say one last thing about how you can help. I would really encourage individuals that are on this to submit comments to the Idaho Governor's Salmon Working Group. You can go to the Idaho Office of Species of Conservation. You can submit comments at any time. And I'll say as a worker member, we have received 95% of them have been pro-breaching. But, and that's hundreds, multi-hundreds of comments. But we can use as many as we can get, so.
I bet you'll get some more over here. The next question is to both of you, are you working with commercial salmon fishermen?
Yes. My son, Joel, he's been on tribal council as I have, and my father's been on our tribal council, and my brother as well. My son, Joel, he's currently working for the Affiliated Tribes of the Northwest Indians. That's a regional organization of tribes that work on issues like the environment, and he's a climate change worker, and he's a fisherman down on the Columbia River. So he's a commercial fisherman, also a subsistence fisherman, but we also work with during meetings, we work with commercial fishermen as their issues coincide with ours.
Yeah, and really my only experience, so the tribes of Hauser were always just subsistence fishermen and fisherwomen. They did trade fish as Western encroachment started moving across this area. But I have started working with some commercial fishermen in the Columbia Basin Partnership, but not to a large degree.
One of the next question is, I suspect COVID's going to put a wrinkle in this, but is the River Rendezvous, Free the Snake Flotilla, or other similar event planned for this year? Elliott?
Well, I'm afraid that that the health part is going to be determining whether that happens, and it doesn't look positive right now because we see a recent surge in COVID-19, and especially in the state of Idaho, and we don't want to put the safety and health of people in jeopardy by having a
Yeah, I don't have much to add, unfortunately. COVID. We've been COVIDed.
Yeah, I will throw out there, and folks should reach out to me at sam@wildsalmon.org or just follow our website. You know, we have been thinking about, because getting folks down to connect to the river, and people who've not experienced the Lower Snake River, whether they live in Spokane or they live on the west side, I think has been really powerful and positive. It's been a really interesting, I think, positive event. And, you know, we can't have 800 people turn out on the river under the current conditions, but we are trying to think about ways of maybe tiny, small group. You know, we're looking at other organizations that are starting to do tiny, very safe kinds of outdoor activities to get people out. And we'll just have to see how things play out. And maybe there are some short, very tiny paddles or hikes or things that we can do to get people on the river into the future. But it's likely in the spring when we'll be doing that, unfortunately. This next one is for you, Scott. Why did Idaho, Oregon, and Idaho Power get to exclude the Upper Snake tribes from the Hells Canyon relicensing process and say that no adult salmonids can pass the Hells Canyon complex coming upstream, and that no juvenile salmon can pass downstream for 20 years?
Well, that's a fantastic question, and I'm going to be very candid. It's not it's no surprise that Idaho and Idaho Power signed onto that agreement. Idaho equates salmon to the wolf. So when wolves were reintroduced into Idaho in '95, so they created this series of ESA-related laws. Idaho per capita uses more water than any other state in the United States. So there's these ESA concerns. But back to that question, why Oregon did that, we have no idea, because Oregon has been a really strong partner with the tribes. I think they probably do better than almost any state in regards to working with the tribes. And in fact, the prior iteration of the 401, Oregon, for the first time in any 401 certification, one of their terms and conditions was that there would have to be passage and reintroduction above Hells Canyon Complex. And we went from that to Oregon signing on to a settlement agreement that prohibits anadromy in the upper state for 20 years. And nobody from Oregon has been able to tell us why they did that. And so I'm sorry, that's a non-answer answer. We just don't know, and it's really confounding.
The next one is, and I may have something to add briefly after you two answer this, but what do you say to irrigators and grain shippers who object to dam removal? Elliott?
Well, while Elliott's getting reconnected.
Reconnected, thanks.
Oh, okay. You want to go ahead, Elliott?
Did you hear the
go ahead.
question?
I didn't even hear the question. Go ahead.
Okay, so I was just going to say, so we engaged the water users, and the water users were a big influence behind the Idaho block area policy. The water users in Idaho wrote the statute that prohibits reintroduction of anadromy. So I engage with water users all the time. I engage with grain growers as well. And, you know, the funny thing is when we try to really put their feet to the fire and say, so if we pulled out those dams, what would you need to, you know, where's the compromise? And they're not willing to speak to that. It's just, they just hold on to those dams, almost like we see some people holding on to Confederate statues. And I don't know why that is, why they're not willing to just speak to the fact of what their needs would be if those dams were pulled out. And when I speak with them, they'll all almost 100% of them will admit the dams are seriously affecting salmon and steelhead, but they prioritize their needs over the needs of salmon and steelhead.
So Elliott, the question was, like, what is the response? How do we respond to irrigators and grain shippers about their opposition to dam removal? And
Right, and I think you've done some work on irrigators, right? I mean, you can answer this just as well, right? That there's not that many that are irrigating from the Lower Snake River dams, correct?
not many.
Not many, but and so I think that even though that's an issue, we can deal with that, and by making some technical adjustments, I believe, and to accommodate that, and that would be relatively an easy fix, just as they say. But I think that I had seen a question about the general council action to talk about the rights of the river, and I think that that's where we're headed, is that we have to change of paradigm thinking of folks that believe that that dams are inviolate, that they're there for now and into the future, because we know that even on the main stem of the Clearwater, on that there was a dam there, and it was removed in the 70s. It was in Lewiston, Idaho, and that was removed, and the earth did not crack and break open. And there's other places like Lower Elwha, the Klamath River, they're engaged in dam breaching. Lower Elwha is very interesting because it's a salmon river as well, salmon steelhead river, and the results are evident of the positive nature of that breaching. So people can look at that and Google Lower Elwha dams to see how that's working. And so the irrigators as well, we have our tribe. We have tribal members who are farmers that lease land for farming, and so we also have to get our agriculture to the markets. But we're concerned. We have our values and principles, however, that won't let us do that to the detriment of Mother Earth. So we try to, as they say, reach that balance. And that's what another point that we'd like to emphasize is there's a balance to all of this.
And I will, I'll speak briefly to it because it's part of the work that we're involved with. I'm involved with in Eastern Washington, and I'll put a slightly more positive spin on it than you did, Scott. Not that recognizing definitely challenges, and there's a very entrenched set of kind of status quo people who just don't want to see any change. But we are having some really positive conversations quietly with shippers and others about what do you all need, what would make you all better off 20 years from now, 30 years from now. And our organizations, we're willing to help get that as part of a package to get those dams removed, and so we're trying to take this, not only leave no one behind, but can we make, Eastern Washington, North Idaho, Northeast Oregon better off in terms of fisheries, in terms of jobs, in terms of modern energy, infrastructure, transportation, and irrigation. And there are some really good conversations happening, and some folks are willing to have that discussion and are sharing kind of the things that they'd like to see on the ground that would be beneficial to Eastern Washington now, whether that's investments in rail, other infrastructure, and would certainly be critical when the Lower Snake dams come out. And I think, and I also just point out too, one thing that has really changed the conversation over here in the last 20 years is the steep decline in shipping that is now happening on the Lower Snake River. Depending on the product we're talking about, it's declined 45 to 70% in the last 20 years for a variety of reasons, because there's more rail, there's more other options. Just the farmers have, and other shippers, some of them have been, they've been leaving the river and going to other options. So we've been looking at how can we get more goods off the river, And I think one thing I do want to say is that I think was productive was the stakeholder listening sessions and process that Governor Inslee spearheaded as part of the Orca Task Force. Some really good information came out of that, and I think that the listening sessions were more worthwhile than I expected, actually. I think it was useful for a packed audience in Lewiston, Idaho, to look at a bunch of stakeholders and panels up on a stage. I got to participate in that. There were shippers, there were outfitters, there was a representative of the Nez Perce Tribe, and it was clear that we all liked each other and had a rapport, and I think there was something about all these angry people in the audience rumbling for a fight, to look at a bunch of folks say, no, yeah, we can have a conversation about this. And so that work's ongoing. And I think too, yeah, the same kind of work is happening on the irrigation front. And I feel a little more hopeful about it, but it's tough. There's definitely entrenched people on that.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that perspective. Living down here in one of the most conservative areas of the United States, it feels at times, where the lower snake really doesn't have any positive impact on water users down here. So, yeah, I appreciate the positivity.
Yeah,
counter my negativity.
It's a challenge. I'm not, for sure, not being Pollyanna on this one. Let's see. We'll take a few more questions. People are still holding on here. If my screen would quit disappearing. Wait, hold on. Here, I'll just ask the first one that I see here. What kind of cooperation is happening among the lower river tribes? And I would throw out all the different tribes in the region on this issue as a question to both of you.
I see a lot of cooperation from my vantage point, I guess. I'm not in the thick of it as in negotiations, for an example, between tribes as a tribal representative per se. But during our flotilla, for an example, we get a lot of participation from other tribes. As I was stating, the Salish Sea is important to the indigenous folks down there, and so we've talked amongst ourselves about how we cooperate with one another, and we've had participations from the Quinaults, for an example, Lummies, and we will continue to do that, to the point that we go down to Seattle and Portland to meet with folks and try to coordinate our activities.
I just briefly, I would say that my hope is, I mentioned the Columbia River Treaty, and so the 15 Columbia Basin tribes have been working together since 2008, 2009 on the Columbia River Treaty. It's really the first example of all Columbia Basin tribes working together for one unified end result. And my hope is that the breaching of the lower four, we can coalesce the tribes around that same issue and work together as all of the tribes. And I have no reason to believe that they won't coalesce around that issue. Something we talk about all the time in meetings. So I'm very, very hopeful.
Next question. Have the tribes brought litigation to challenge the mortality of salmon by federal dams as a violation of the Nez Perce's or Shoshone Bannock's treaty rights to hunt and fish?
Well, there's been a lot of litigation, whether that's been a subject of a particular piece of case or particular case, then I'm not sure that exact language has been used, but definitely the fact that there are 13 species on the endangered species list is cause for concern, and the tribes have sued to restore the rivers. And so that's basically what we're doing now, is we're trying to advocate. When it's ripe to litigate, we will, but we first must use every means necessary to try and get a decision to, for an example, breach the dams that is going to be responsible as well. And so we believe that by doing that, then the salmon will be restored. And so I don't see that suing on that particular point is in the future, but we may look at other pieces of litigation that would get us a quicker result, for an example.
Yeah, I would, speaking for you, sir, not the Shoshone Bannock, very similar to what Elliott just said. The Shoshone Bannock are more inclined to work through processes than litigate. And it's something I mentioned earlier. It's a real big risk reward litigating over treaty rights because you stand to win a lot, but you also stand to lose a lot. And so you have to make that calculation. I would say that there was a very, very, very great Supreme Court decision in 2018 reaffirming the Fort Bridger Treaty. If anybody's interested, it's Wyoming versus Herrera case. Very important decision through the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it seems. Excuse me. It seems to me that the Northwest won a Supreme Court case just because it got tied. That was when there was only eight members of the Supreme Court on that particular case, and so some of these are nail biters, that we're waiting. I think that was an environmental one as well, that case. But yeah, those risks are well known, that Scott was talking about, that it is risky to put decisions a body that isn't really responsible to us, kind of thing. So it's really a risk. So we'd rather negotiate and somehow come to an agreement that encapsulates our needs, not have somebody else determine that for us.
Yeah. I think we're gonna maybe answer two more questions, and then we're getting kind of to nearly to 6:30, 6:20. One is, so lots of folks, just to give a little preface, we had this draft environmental impact statement that I'm sure most of the listeners and participants here followed or participated and sent comments in. And a final EIS is going to be issued here in the coming couple of weeks, with the government's federal agencies plan to restore salmon and steelhead. And one of the questions that was asked is, how do the tribes intend to respond to the federal EIS that claims to have considered their input, yet few of us have much hope in what is actually going to be in that document? And if either of you kind of have thoughts on that.
Well, from my perspective, you just said it, Sam, that I don't have a lot of hope and that there will be a different language in the opinion, and the courts haven't approved any, so they don't have a very good track record of developing a biological opinion that will hold weight as far as the court's concerned, and we don't see that happening either now. And so we're going to have to coalesce and see what the other tribes are doing, and see what kind of pressure can be put on to change that outcome some way. And that's what our efforts will be engaged in.
Yeah, maybe. Oh, did you have any? Sorry, Scott, I just cut you off there.
No, I think I really don't have much more to add to what Elliott said. That's kind of the path that we were discussing too. So.
Yeah. And so I think we can end with one question here that I hope that maybe we can have a hopeful spin. It's just rough right now, right? Where we're seeing such devastated runs. The steelhead season's been coming, the fishing closures are happening. We're having just a fraction of what should be coming up the river in terms of salmon and steelhead. And it's heartbreaking for all the fishing dependent communities. But one of the questions here that was asked is, how long can our salmon runs withstand the presence of the lower four Snake River dams? And can both or either of you offer up some hope for how we can make sure they're around for the next generations?
Right. Yeah, I think that's the issue is whether we've done the most we can in order to prevent that. And so we have to look at we have to be reflective of our activities and our plans, and be able to make calculated judgments about whether we're going in the right direction or not. And I like the fact that we have been able to get together with other organizations is really a positive note. That people are talking, that's positive. And we can hold this kind of forum that people can participate in. And then we need to get that mobilized to the next level, and get the decision makers then to agree with us that those dams need to be breached. So I'm hopeful that in the next year or so that we need more people. We need people to join us. We need people to speak up. We need to put that on everyone's agenda, whether you're talking about a city council or a county commissioner meeting or any kind of meeting that deals with public policy. We get that in those groups in order to educate ourselves and people about these issues, and the health of our communities depend on that. And it's not only the tribal community, it's our larger communities that are really dependent on us to help lead the way to restore the Snake River. So we'll be working with folks, and even though it doesn't look hopeful with the flotilla, that we still think that there's enough engagement, community engagement in this, that there is a need that we can meet to get the word out, to help mobilize and organize folks so that we can get it done. So we are hopeful, and working with folks like Scott, then we can make sure that ours is the best arguments going forward.
Yeah, and I know we're short on time, and I'll just say I truly am hopeful too. Several things that have really encouraged me is both in the Columbia Basin Partnership, the NOAA Fisheries work, and the Idaho governor's work. I'll look at the Idaho governors. We've gone to some like Salmon, Idaho, and Lewiston, and we've had turnout of 50, 75, 100 people who come and give testimony that say, we want our fish back. We don't care. We want our fish back. We'll pay more for power. And I mean, these are people of all walks and stripes of life. That's very encouraging to me. And, I was a little negative on water users and shippers earlier. But in working with some of those groups and some of these processes, when the process started, they were there to protect their interests, but they've got to know me, tribal members, and they have seen the passion that we have for these fish. And I really think that it has, in part, touched them, and they realize that they're not just fish. So I'm really hopeful in that. Have had some very encouraging discussions with people, recognizing that they're not just fish. There's so much more than that.
And I'll just echo too. I have seen a real shift in public opinion in Eastern Washington, where I live, and also just the folks who are speaking up, like you've talked about, Scott, and Elliott, you mentioned, having the fishing dependent businesses in Central Idaho stand up has been incredible. Having the orca advocates, thank you all to the orca advocates who have really changed the politics and conversation in Washington State. And thank you, someone mentioned in the chat, thank you for all the river advocates working on their own rivers that have gotten dams out on the Elwha, on Condit, on Sandy, on Rogue, because we haven't had an unsuccessful dam removal yet. And I think the public seeing these huge success stories and salmon coming back and, tribes having fish, other fishermen having fish, and the communities celebrating that has really changed the conversation. And we're also, I think you mentioned this a bit too, Scott, we have definitely seen movement from the electeds, our senators and our governors, that where they are opening up and supporting stakeholder conversations. You've got Republican Mike Simpson in Idaho in your state, Scott, as you mentioned earlier, announcing, saying we've got to do what we need to do to restore these fish. And it's really, it is because of all these folks speaking up. So I just want to end, or you guys can, any other final comments you have, but thank everyone participating tonight. Thank you for everyone who's caring about this. And just keep it up, because it is making a difference. And you can get more information on how to engage at our website. Go to Nimiipuu Protecting.org. And I don't know the name of, the tagline for your website, Scott, but all that information is in the chat there. And just urge folks to get involved locally and with whatever organization that fits you. But I think everyone working together, we can get this done. Thank you. I know.
Thank you.
Scott?
Yeah, thanks.
Yep.
Thanks for hosting this, Sam and Carrie and Jacob and Joseph. I appreciate you guys putting this on so we can continue to get that word out. And thanks to Scott. I like the PowerPoint presentation and the words that you brought this evening. So hopefully everyone will stay safe, put your masks back on, get 6 feet apart, and then we'll be able to get through this, and we'll be able to get our gatherings back together.
Yeah, and thank you both again, Elliott and Scott, for participating tonight and sharing your knowledge.
Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks, Sam. And unfortunate, but fortunate for Joseph. He's on the river right now, I know. That he wasn't here, but I really appreciate him reaching out. And it was a real privilege, Elliott, presenting with you. So just really appreciate the offer to talk about the Upper Snake. It's an incredibly important part of the basin that often gets forgotten. So thank you so much.
Right.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Good night.
Good night.